This morning's reading is taken from John chapter 15 and verses 9 to 17. It follows on immediately from last week's reading, where Jesus declared himself to be the real vine. So instead of the vine being the image for the whole of Israel, Jesus takes this title on himself and talks to the disciples about how they need to be the branches attached to that vine in order to bear much fruit. He goes on to say, "I love you just as the Father loves me. Remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My commandment is this: love one another, just as I love you. The greatest love a person can have for his friends is to give his life for them. And you are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because a servant does not know what his master is doing. Instead, I call you friends, because I have told you everything I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me. I chose you and appointed you to go and bear much fruit, the kind of fruit that endures. And so the Father will give you whatever you ask of him in my name. This then is what I command you: love one another." Those are really challenging words, aren't they? I mean, they're words of great joy and great commission, but they are incredibly challenging because it's very easy to say those words, love one another. But what that really means is so incredibly different from how we live our own lives, where we grow up in a tribal setting, belonging to our own local context, believing who's in and who's out, and having our own prejudices confirmed within our own families and friends, people who we're supposed to talk to, people who we're supposed not to, people who we're supposed to help, and those who we aren't. Jesus comes and unifies all people everywhere. Everybody was made by God. Everybody is loved by God. And Jesus in his person demonstrates unconditional love that comes freely to all people. You did not choose me. I chose you, Jesus says. And so it is with all people. God comes to each one of us and asks us to recognize God, the God that is already in our hearts, to come home and to be made complete. The joy that we may have is Jesus' joy, joy in being complete in his love. But to be a community of people who love one another. It's very, very easy to be part of a community of faith, to see Jesus, to praise God, to be filled with the Spirit, and to do all manner of work to keep that organization going, to give of your time and your energy, the talents that God has grown and entrusted into your care, and to work very hard for God, we would say. But the real calling for all people everywhere, and all Christians in particular, is to love one another. And that includes other Christians, as well as people who aren't inside. It's very difficult in any group of people to remain focused on God, to remain focused on something greater than yourselves. Think of any organization that you've ever belonged to, and how factions will develop and people will take up power and enjoy certain priority care over others, how some people are treated well and some people are not, how some people are ignored and some people are indulged. We're a complicated bunch, us human beings, and our motivations always inevitably focus back on the self. And it is those personal ambitions that Jesus calls us to put aside. We are called to bear much fruit, and that fruit is serving other people. My Father's glory, Jesus said last week in verse 8, is shown by your bearing much fruit, and in this way you become my disciples. And that fruit is good works. Good works. The works that make a difference in people's lives. The works that bring encouragement and enthusiasm, that build people up, that make them aware of how important they are and how their contribution matters, how God values them just as much as God values any one of us, and that we are in this way all the same, all God's children, all equally loved, all equally special, and so called to be light for the world, that people's joy may be complete. God comes to us first and foremost, shows us unconditional love, and calls us to do the same with other people. But how do we maintain that focus on God? How in our service, even of God, do we maintain pure and altruistic and focused always, of course, upon God's glory and not our own? It's very, very difficult. One thing that helps is to have a defined role, something that you particularly know God has called you to do, and to do it with joy, and to do it with gladness and thankfulness, and then try not to do everything else as well. God has specifically equipped each one of us for a particular ministry, and if we can find out what that is and do it happily, gladly, joyfully, then in some ways we'll play our part in being the vine and bearing some kind of fruit. But one mustn't get weighed down by trying to be all things to all people. Instead, recognize what God has grown in you and keep that local. Keep it amongst the people that you're with. Share your gifts always, readily, but don't try to conquer the world. God has done that already. Love has triumphed. Jesus is raised. But for each one of us in our local context, look at how we interact with each other. Our Christian brothers and sisters, our friends, our neighbours, our work colleagues, all of those we interact with. And may our actions bear the fruit of unconditional love, the love that was given to us freely by God. This is our calling, each one of us. And then a community will inevitably grow, and then the tensions will develop, and the difficulties arise, and the differences of opinions, and self will come back into the equation. It's so difficult to live constantly seeking to help the needs of others, seeking to have everyone else's priorities just as much as your own. But this is our calling. We have been given love so freely, and we are called to give it back, because it was never really ours to own. Just like all the gifts and talents that we have grown over the years, these are gifts entrusted to us by God, as indeed is every waking moment. So let's give that sacrifice of gifts and time back to God, honouring God, praising God, by serving others. And all those others means everybody, without exception. Love one another. If there is one hallmark that people should be able to look at any Christian's life and recognise God working in them, it would be because they love one another. They love all people, and they are filled with joy. May that be the case for each one of us as we continue to journey with God and continue to submit ourselves, surrender ourselves to the love that God so richly wants us to know.